She thought she was going to get a red buzzer?
Simon Cowell walked on stage for Britain's Got Talent in 2016 with armor he had worn for decades. For years, millions watched him break contestants with cutting remarks. Then, during Courtney Hadwin's audition, something cracked inside him. Tears filled his eyes, not from her voice, but from what he recognized in her story. The question the internet asked for weeks: what did he see in that moment that changed him? The panel was set up the way it had been for over a decade. Judges sat in their chairs. Cameras pointed at them. Contestants walked onto the stage one after another. And the audience waited to see who would receive kindness and who would receive the knife. Simon Cowell was 46 years old in 2016. He had built his career on a single, unchanging principle: control. Never let them see you affected. Never show them your hand. For more than 10 years before Courtney Hadwin walked into that audition room, Simon had become famous for one thing above all else. He said no. He said it sharply. He said it often. Millions of people tuned in to watch him tell strangers their dreams wouldn't happen. He was the man who delivered brutal honesty without the courtesy of gentleness. His face was practiced neutral. His voice never wavered. When a contestant cried after his critique, the camera showed no reaction from him. Nothing. He had built walls so thick around himself that emotion seemed impossible. But what made Simon different from other cruel judges was something harder to see. He wasn't cruel because he enjoyed it. He was distant because distance had kept him safe his entire life. He came from a world where softness was a liability. His father was Eric Philip Cowell, a music executive and television producer. His mother was Julie, a former ballet dancer turned socialite. Simon grew up in an environment where success was expected and vulnerability was not an option. By the time he started appearing on television as a judge, he had spent decades learning not to flinch. Other judges on BGT would occasionally crack. They would smile at a child's ambition or wipe away tears at a sob story. Not Simon. He stayed locked in. He stayed protected. The audience had learned to expect this from him. They tuned in for it. They wanted to see if this would be the contestant who could move the unmoved. Did Simon ever show this emotional side of himself before Courtney's audition? Or was this truly the first crack in his armor? Drop your answer in the comments below. What do you think shaped Simon into the judge he became? On that day, in 2016, everything about Simon's routine seemed set. He was prepared to continue being exactly what he had always been. The judge who said no. The judge who never softened. The judge who delivered truths without mercy and walked away unchanged. What he didn't know yet was that in less than 5 minutes, every piece of that armor would fracture. A 13-year-old girl from West Virginia would walk onto that stage and accidentally reveal something about Simon that nobody had seen in 20 years of television. What happened next was something nobody in that room had prepared for. By the time Courtney Hadwin's name was called, the audition room had already processed dozens of hopefuls. Children had sung. Adults had danced. Magicians had failed their tricks. The cameras and the audience had developed a rhythm. They waited for the opening moments of each act to signal whether this would be memorable or forgettable. When Courtney walked out, nothing in those opening moments suggested that anything was about to change. She was 13 years old. She came from Morgantown, West Virginia, a city of about 30,000 people nestled in the Appalachian region. She was not famous. She had no credits to her name. She had trained in musical theater in her hometown, learning the fundamentals in a school setting. But she was unknown outside of her community. The producers watching her walk out would have sorted her into the familiar category. Another promising young talent, auditioning in front of a national audience, hoping to be discovered. She was shy during her introduction. She spoke quietly. She wore simple clothes. There was nothing in her presentation that screamed star. The camera showed Simon's face as she took her position. He looked exactly as he always did at this point in an audition, neutral, waiting, already prepared to deliver whatever dismissal he had scripted for someone at her level of fame. But Courtney Hadwin had carried something into that room that most children in the auditions had not carried. She had lived through things. The details would come out later, in interviews after her success. Her family life had been difficult. She had known instability. She had developed a resilience that most teenagers her age had not needed to develop. Her voice training was solid, but more importantly, Her voice carried something else underneath the technical skill. It carried experience. It carried weight. It carried the kind of truth that only comes from having survived something. The other judges might not have seen it in those early moments, but there were clues, if anyone had been looking carefully. The way she held herself on stage wasn't nervous, it was present. The way she looked at Simon when he made his expression wasn't defiant, but calm. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was about to show him something. Most people watching the audition would remember it only as the moment Simon cried. But the real story had already begun the moment she stepped forward. The question wasn't what would she sing. The question was, what did she already know that nobody in that room had figured out yet? The answer had been sitting in plain sight for years, and it was about to surface in the next 7 minutes. The first notes hit the room, and the temperature changed. Courtney had chosen It's a Man's World, the James Brown classic. It was an audacious choice for a 13-year-old. Most children her age would have picked something contemporary, something their age group would recognize. This song was released in 1966. It was written for an adult male voice, full of lower register and life experience. It was almost impossible for a teenager to sing without sounding like a teenager trying to sing it. Courtney didn't sound like a teenager trying to sing it. She sounded like someone who understood what the song meant. The opening lines carried weight. Her voice had dropped into a register that shouldn't have been possible for her age. It was mature. It was wounded in ways that suggested she understood the struggle the lyrics described. The audition room didn't make a sound. The camera caught Simon's face frame by frame. The shift happened gradually at first, then all at once. His jaw tightened. His eyes, which had been ready to critique, fixed on her. The neutral expression he had perfected over decades began to fail. This wasn't a good audition. This was something else. This was a girl singing about things she had no business understanding, singing them anyway, and singing them perfectly. By the middle of the second verse, Simon had stopped looking like a judge. He had started looking like someone witnessing something he couldn't unsee. The other judges felt it too. They were leaning forward. The audience had gone quiet in a way that suggested they knew something significant was happening in real time. Courtney wasn't performing. She was speaking. The song was a conversation between her and someone she had loved and lost or missed or never had the chance to know. Every phrase carried intention. Every breath was placed with precision. This wasn't about hitting the notes correctly. This was about living inside the song, so completely that the notes became secondary to the meaning. When she finished the final note and held it, the room stayed silent for almost 3 full seconds. That silence was the loudest part of the audition. 3 seconds might not sound like much, but on television, on a stage, in front of hundreds of people and millions of viewers later, 3 seconds of silence meant everything. It meant nobody could speak yet. Nobody had words ready. What happened in those 3 seconds was the exact thing Simon had spent 20 years learning not to let happen. He was affected. A 13-year-old girl from West Virginia had reached through all his defenses and touched something real. What Courtney didn't know in that moment was that her voice had done something impossible. It had made the unmoved judge remember being moved. It had shown him something about himself that he had learned to hide. If you want to see what happens in the judge's room after she finishes, make sure you're subscribed. The next moment changes everything. The room exhaled. Simon sat in his chair and did something he had not done on camera in years. He cried. Not tears that ran down his face from an attempt to hold them back. Actual tears. His eyes filled and water ran down his cheeks, and he did not hide it. He did not reach for a tissue quickly. He did not wipe his face and pretend it hadn't happened. He sat with it. He let it be. The other judges watched him. The audience watched him. Millions of people who had never seen Simon Cowell cry were seeing it for the first time. Amanda Holden, sitting next to him, was visibly shocked. David Walliams, the comedian across from him, was leaning forward with an expression that said, "Did that really just happen?" Even Alicia Dixon seemed surprised. They had all worked with Simon for years. They knew his coldness as a trademark. His distance was part of the brand. When he finally spoke, his voice carried emotion that had no place in his usual critique. He told Courtney that she had something extraordinary. He told her that she was going to have a career. He told her things that sounded less like a judge's assessment and more like a promise. There was no cruelty in his words. There was no sharpness. There was only recognition of something real. The camera showed the audience's reaction. People were leaning forward. Some were crying themselves. The energy in the room had shifted completely. This wasn't about whether Courtney was talented. Everyone already knew that. This was about watching a man's armor fail in real time. This was about seeing someone allow themselves to be changed by what they had just witnessed. Within hours, the clip went viral. Entertainment blogs picked it up first, then the news outlets. Then social media exploded completely. Millions of people who hadn't seen the episode live sought it out. They watched Simon cry. They read the comments from other viewers. They tried to figure out what had happened in that moment. Why her? Why now? What was he seeing that the rest of them should be understanding? The theory started immediately. Some people said he was tired. Some said he was getting older and softer. Some said it was a performance, a way to make himself look more human. But most people understood that what they were watching was real. A person had allowed themselves to be moved, and the world had watched it happen. Most people have known someone who kept a secret for so long that it changed them from the inside. Someone who carried something private and didn't share it. That kind of silence has a cost. It shapes the way you move through the world. It makes you careful. It makes you distant. Watching Simon cry was watching someone's careful distance fail. It was watching the cost of all that silence become visible. What the audience didn't know yet was why. They didn't know that Courtney's performance had reminded Simon of something specific. They didn't know that in her voice, he had heard an echo of his own story. They didn't know that the tears weren't just about her talent. They were about recognition. They were about seeing yourself in someone else's struggle and not being able to hide from it anymore. The question spread across social media in variations. Everyone wanted the same answer. What had Simon seen in that 13-year-old girl that broke him open? The truth would take months to fully surface, and when it did, it would change how everyone understood that moment. That single decision, to let himself feel, to not look away, to allow the cameras to see him cry, would set off a chain of events that neither Simon nor Courtney could have predicted. In the weeks after the episode aired, Simon gave an interview. The questions kept coming, and eventually he answered them. Courtney's performance, he explained, had reminded him of his own journey. It wasn't about her voice, though her voice was extraordinary. It was about what her voice revealed about her character. She was a girl singing about the adult world from the perspective of someone who had already seen its cruelty. She was singing about loss and longing from a place of genuine understanding. She wasn't pretending. She was bearing witness. That was what had reached him. That authenticity, that willingness to put everything real into an art form and risk being judged for it. Simon had spent his career teaching people not to be vulnerable. He had built an industry around toughness and distance and the ability to hear criticism without flinching. But Courtney had reminded him of something he had forgotten. Vulnerability, when it's real, is stronger than any armor. Simon also revealed something about his own past in that interview. He had come from privilege, yes, but he had also come from pressure. He had been expected to succeed. He had been shaped by a world that didn't leave much room for failure or softness. But he had found his voice anyway. He had learned to trust his instincts even when they contradicted what people around him believed. Courtney had done the same thing. She had taken her pain and her experience and her voice and placed them on a stage in front of a judge who had trained himself not to feel anything. And in doing so, she had reminded him that he was capable of feeling everything. The tears, he said, were recognition. They were the moment a professional finally seeing someone who understood what he understood. They were respect for her bravery. They were also something else. They were compassion for the part of himself that he had locked away decades ago. After that audition, Courtney's life changed rapidly. She went on to win Britain's Got Talent that year, 2016, in a competition that seemed impossible given her age and background. Judges from other talent shows who had seen her performance started calling. Record labels became interested. Within months, she had a record deal. Within a year, she was touring. The shy 13-year-old from West Virginia became a working performer with a career stretching out in front of her. But something else changed too. In the years following Courtney's audition, Simon Cowell was seen in a different light. The image of the heartless judge began to fade. People started to see him differently. He was still sharp. He was still honest. But the armor had cracks now, and everyone knew it. In interviews, he was more willing to talk about emotion. In future editions, he showed more compassion. The public had seen him cry, and they had learned something important about him. That distance wasn't the same as coldness. That criticism wasn't the same as cruelty. That even someone trained their entire life not to feel could be moved to tears by the presence of something true. The audition room connection between Simon and Courtney became the thing the internet called the moment everything changed. For him, it was the moment he allowed himself to feel what he had been trained not to feel. For her, it was the moment she learned that bearing witness to her own truth could change other people's lives. For the millions watching, it was proof that connection happens when someone is finally brave enough to show up completely. 7 minutes on stage. One song. One moment of recognition between a judge and a girl. And an entire person's carefully built reputation altered forever. That single moment would become the thing that people remembered about Simon Cowell more than any cutting remark, any dismissal, any moment of cruelty. They would remember the moment he broke open. But this story doesn't end there. What happened after that audition, the conversations that took place behind closed doors, the decisions both Simon and Courtney made in the months that followed, and what that moment ultimately revealed about the cost of distance. That's a story even fewer people have looked into. That story is coming next. If this video gave you something to think about, leave a comment below. What do you think about the moment someone finally breaks through your defenses? Subscribe and hit the bell. The next video is one you'll want to see. This story doesn't end here. What happened after that audition, the conversations that took place behind closed doors, the decisions both Simon and Courtney made in the months that followed, and what that moment ultimately revealed about the cost of distance. That's a story even fewer people have looked into. That story is coming next. If this video gave you something to think about, leave a comment below. What do you think about the moment someone finally breaks through your defenses? Subscribe and hit the bell. The next video is one you'll want to see.